When Doyle was convicted of murder during a 1987 robbery, he was sentenced to the death penalty via lethal injection. However, while awaiting his punishment on death row, Doyle would develop lymphatic cancer, a disease which would end up saving his life. At approximately 9 p.m. on February 22, 2018, Doyle was strapped to the bed ready to be executed. But because of his treatment for cancer and hepatitis C, along with his many years of drug use, the execution team couldn't find his veins. They struggled for nearly 3 hours, and in that time they punctured him 11 times in the legs, ankle, and even his groin. This caused several injuries to his organs, and around 11:27 p.m., the execution team finally gave up. And fortunately for him, the legal death warrant expired at midnight. Because of how bad they botched this procedure, law enforcement didn't want to risk further backlash or lawsuits, so they changed his punishment to life in prison. Doyle ended up escaping his death penalty. However, in 2021, he passed away because of cancer-related complications. Now, his luck didn't compare to John Babacombe Lee, who survived 3 attempts to be hanged. John originally served in the British Royal Navy. However, after being discharged for his injuries, he became a convicted thief for stealing $20 worth of silverware from his master. Upon being released from prison, his master decided to give him another chance. However, later that year, she was found dead, with her throat literally slit side to side. Because of his criminal record, the fact that he was the only male in the house at the time, along with having a cut on his arm, police suspected John to be the killer. The evidence against him was completely circumstantial, and without a proper trial, they sentenced him to death. John was taken to the gallows and they attempted to hang him. However, the trapdoor didn't open. They then tested the contraption without him being on it, and it magically worked. But for some reason, every time he was standing there, it just didn't. So after 3 attempts, people started freaking out, because this seemed more like psychological torture than anything else, and the executioner actually refused to continue. John's life was spared that day and his death sentence was changed to life in prison. Things only got better for him because he was finally released years later after appealing the case many times. Now, someone who survived a crazier execution was Wenceslao Miguel. Wenceslao was captured during the Mexican Revolution and accused of being a rebel and traitor. So, without any sort of trial, he was given the death penalty, and the execution was to be done by a firing squad. A firing squad consists of 9 officers shooting at him at the same time from close range, with the final officer getting the kill shot, the coup de grace, right here in his head. Now, this is how you know this guy was meant to live. After all 10 shots were fired, the officers assumed the job was done. They pretty much said, "Alright boys, good day, peace out, see you guys tomorrow," and they left. Miraculously, Wenceslao somehow survived, and the whole time he was just playing dead, waiting for them to leave. When the coast was clear, he crawled his way to a church where he was then nursed back to health. He later lived to tell the story, however his face was fully disfigured after that. Next, we have Anne Green, who survived one of the most brutal executions. In the year 1650, Anne Green, who was a slave at the time, was doing a bit of fooling around with the master's grandson, and she ended up getting pregnant by him. Unfortunately, Anne had a miscarriage and was petrified of what was gonna happen to her next, so she attempted to bury the fetus in a cesspit. However, she got caught and was charged with infanticide. Anne was taken to Oxford Castle in order to be hanged, and I'm sure you could guess. Back in those days, the executions wouldn't always go as planned. Upon being dropped, she didn't pass away immediately. In fact, she struggled on the rope for a full half hour until it was believed that she was dead. However, in a crazy turn of events, the next day when the physicians opened up the coffin, they noticed that Anne had a faint pulse. So they literally did everything they could to restore her back to life. And get this, authorities ended up pardoning Anne and setting her free, saying this was all a sign from God that she was innocent. Now, while Anne didn't deserve her punishment, the same couldn't be said about Rommel Broom, one of the most disgusting convicts in history. Rommel's criminal tirades began from a young age. It started out from petty theft, then gradually escalated to car robberies, which would continue to land him in and out of prison. Now he really put the nail in his own coffin when he raped 2 young girls and murdered 1, all the while trying to do the same to a 3rd girl. This guy was a monster. He wasn't gonna stop. Rommel eventually got arrested and was given the death penalty by lethal injection. And very similar to the first guy we talked about, the executioner couldn't find his veins. So they just started jabbing, and not like just once. I mean over and over and over again, all over his body. And at one point, the needle even hit his bones. They eventually gave up, and because of this botched procedure, his lawyer tried to get his re-execution thrown out the window. However, the courts didn't budge, and his new execution date was set for June 17, 2020. But this guy gets lucky once again, and that date gets pushed back another 2 years, and ultimately, Rommel never receives his death sentence, and instead, he dies in prison because of Rona. Now, someone who didn't deserve their death penalty but survived it was Willie Francis, a man who was a victim of racial injustice. In 1944, a pharmacist by the name of Andrew Thomas was shot and murdered in Louisiana. The case was completely cold for 9 months, and all of a sudden they arrest Willie Francis in Texas for only suspicions of drug trafficking. Police then claim they found Andrew's wallet inside of Willie's pocket. While on trial, inconsistency after inconsistency pop up in the detective stories. Evidence went missing, and Willie's defense attorney didn't even put up a defense. Needless to say, they were just looking for somebody to blame. So they did. The courts convicted him and gave him the death penalty by electric chair. As he was strapped to the chair and the switch was flipped, Willie began shouting and screaming. Turns out the guard who was supposed to set up the chair hadn't done so properly because he got drunk. Willie ended up surviving and tried to appeal his re-execution. However, they just wouldn't let it go. Police insisted on pointing the fingers at this man. Unfortunately, 1 year later, they gave him the electric chair once again, and this time, it worked. Now, even though Willie Francis couldn't fully escape his death sentence, the same couldn't be said about Zoleika Katkoda, who survived one of the most horrendous executions. At the age of 20, Zoleika was accused of adultery in Iran. This sort of crime in that country comes with a death sentence of stoning. Pretty much the individual's lower half is buried in the ground with the upper half above ground. From there, I'm sure you could guess what happens. People just line up and they just go at it, non-stop till you're gone. It's bad. Now, even though the people in Zoleika's village tried to stop this, the stoning continued until she was presumed dead. Zoleika was then taken to the morgue, and all of a sudden, they discovered that she was still breathing lightly. They then rushed her to the hospital and helped her fully recover back to 100%. Now, the Iranian people pushed really hard against the government to get Zoleika pardoned, and it actually worked. Her death sentence was finally lifted and she became a free woman.